I read recently that many times, by the way, and I think Jonathan Haidt details this, 60% of young women with a liberal political orientation have a diagnosed mental illness. Now that's self-reported, and so there's problems with that. But I'm wondering to what degree, and I'm not necessarily pointing the finger at the liberal ethos here. I'm wondering about this immense rise in neurotic mental illness that seems to be characteristic of our culture.
Let's bring in to the image of the golden calf, right? Because I think the key insight is to recognize that anytime a group of people move themselves into this way of being in relationship with each other and with the world, that is, the word I used was aggregate. I think we've used different words to describe it, meaning they're not in communion as a well-integrated whole, but are in fact parts endeavoring to pull themselves together by means of something like consensus. There's a lot of other things to bring in together, but that's a way we've talked about it. That does in fact have an inevitable collapse and a downward spiral into chaos, right? That was the argument that you made earlier, or that you brought forward earlier. And from my point of view, as well as I understand it, that is the case. And so
well, it's sort of by definition, if it's an aggregate that isn't unified by the appropriate higher order principle, it's going to disintegrate.
Yes, that's correct.
Right?
Yeah.
That's why that principle isn't ideal, because
right.
It disintegrates.
And so, can we go here? I'm gonna take it up like one level, that may be more than we can handle right now in this, like where we are. But the basic idea is that the ability to actually form well-integrated wholes that include a diversity of people outside of a small group of people who are genetically related has not actually been a solved problem. So we've actually had three cuts at this. One is the indigenous mode, which is small groups of people who are genetically related, live within a culture that has been the same culture for everybody for a very large number of generations. And by the way, if you investigate the indigenous modes, they have incredibly powerful psychotechnologies for inhibiting things like self-deception or tyrannical norms, right? So it's a whole integrated complex that forms a relatively stable over long periods of time.
Long periods of time.
Right? Aborigines.
Like 25,000 years.
Right, long periods of time. Yeah. But has the inability to grow beyond a certain number of people.
About 200.
1,500 if you think about the way they create metagroups.
Okay.
And has the inability to actually integrate people who have any real diversity of intrinsics, either different languages or different genetics, or different, actually just ways of being raised. Right?
Yeah.
They have a small amount, but not big. The problem with that is that if you flip over here and you discover there's a new toolkit that has the ability to have a cosmopolitan, expansive polity that can in fact grow a large number of people and can absorb a wide diversity of people, this produces a certain generative capacity along the dimension of power. Because it has that
deteriorates
capacity,
in that direction.
Well, it has it both as a positive. It can produce, say, for example, innovation, right? It can produce a way of orienting towards the productive environment to produce more food, for example. It can solve more problems strategically. That's maybe a better way of putting it.
That's the advantage of diversity, let's say.
Yeah, it can solve more problems strategically. And it can deploy more focused power on a particular problem domain. So by the way, it goes very high at the level of purpose, but is not able to actually go as high at the level of values because the values have a very hard time being integrated. A coherent, well-integrated top to bottom where conscience is non-tyrannical, which is why it has to develop tyrannical conscience, i.e. the Pharaoh, to be able to establish something like order in that context.
You think that's a necessary first step?
Probably about a third step, I'm guessing. You look at so you move from Moses to Saul and then ultimately across, you kind of see it happening over time. Like there's a period of time where it can be held together by something like a shared esprit or a felt sense of a deep moment of being together. Like think about the Romans on the hills with the Celts coming to destroy them, and they managed to come together and they produce something, and the Republic is actually able to achieve a certain level of being a republic for a while, but it goes through a degenerative cycle. But it still has to ultimately, the only toolkit it can go to is something like a golden calf, something like a way to hold an aggregate together, because it has still become an aggregate, because we have not yet figured out how to turn these kinds of large cosmopolitan at-scale groups of people into a well-integrated whole.
Well, so one of the logical, likely pathways of devolution, you talked about the golden calf, is like sequential appeal to sequential hedonistic demands.
Sure.
You can make peace with a toddler that way.
Yeah.
You just give the toddler what he wants every time he asks.
Bread, circuses, and empire.
Yeah.
Empire is. Think about how
Yeah.
empire works. I go out, I conquer my neighbor, so I'm able to actually bring booty back to my people. So they have a sequential satisfaction of lower self demands, which keeps them relatively stable for some amount of time, but not for a very long time, because it is structurally, fundamentally unstable, as you said, so it
Yeah.
will undergo collapse, which is where we are.